Max Verstappen might genuinely be about to do the impossible, and frankly, none of us should be surprised. Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going over the United States Grand Prix that takes place in Austin. You may also hear this race referred to as COTA, which stands for the Circuit of the Americas. This is actually the second of 3 US-based Grand Prix of the season, but of all the US Grand Prix, it is the one with the most history. The first race took place here in 2012 after the purpose-built track was completed. But this was not the first time that we saw Formula One racing in the United States. Prior to COTA opening and ending in 2007, we actually used to run a Formula One Grand Prix in Indianapolis. However, I would say that COTA is probably the most classic US Grand Prix, and it's also the race where everybody decides to do their best Texas impression, which I always find a little entertaining. It is very much always a bunch of people trying to do the most stereotypical version of the United States that they can find. Always there are cowboy hats involved, and sometimes we even have drivers ride horses down the pit lane if you remember Danny Rick's era. But all in all, this is actually one of my favorite tracks and holds a special place in my heart because in 2023, this was the very first Grand Prix I attended in person. And as this weekend showed us, this track is an unpredictable one and also usually provides really great racing. At least at one point during the weekend, which we definitely had and we'll get into more here. But before we dive into the actual race itself, if you're new here, we always talk about what was going on going into the race weekend. Then we break down the weekend in pretty much chronological order, and we end with your race questions that you've sent in, as well as your hot takes and predictions. And I will always, of course, give you a couple of my own. If you're new to the podcast and you're just stumbling along, welcome. And also, if you want to make sure you have a chance to send in your questions during race recaps, or have your hot takes or predictions read out at the end of the episode, make sure that you are, of course, subscribed to the podcast either on YouTube or whatever app you're listening to it on now, and make sure that you're following me on social media at Marissa Kumari. At the end of every episode, you can always put your questions, comments, and predictions in the comments on YouTube, but at the end of every race on social media, I will ask you if you had any questions about the race and your hot takes and predictions, which is where I work them in at the end of every episode. So if you want to be able to send in questions or hot takes, make sure that you are following me there so that you can make sure to get them in for next weekend. But let's start with what was going on before the race weekend even started. I would say that we actually had a pretty eventful pre-race week. We had a number of contracts signed, an ill-timed lawsuit that is bringing up a lot of questions when it comes to what's going on at McLaren, and championship math that was really starting to get interesting. Starting with the rumor mill, Christian Horner, who is the former team principal of Red Bull, who also abruptly left the team mid-season this year, has been linked to 3 different teams through the rumor mill. At first, we saw Christian Horner's name linked to Haas, and while the team actually did address those rumors, they did say that they actually did engage in conversation with him, but that the conversation really went nowhere and that they are not going to be bringing him over. The second team that we are seeing rumors about him speaking to is Aston Martin, and the third team, which actually made it into the media day questions, was Ferrari. Fred Vasseur has had this rumor mill surrounding him about whether or not he'll stay with the team and whether or not Ferrari is happy with objectively low performance for this team rebuild that they've gone through. They have 2 very strong drivers, and yet they have not been able to rebuild this team into a championship winning team or even a race winning team, really. And so inevitably, when you have a team like Ferrari that is a legacy team that is known for winning and that isn't winning, there are always going to be conversations around whether or not that team principal is going to stay in place. However, the idea of Christian Horner coming over to Ferrari is something that has been disputed by Lewis Hamilton directly. Not only have we seen Fred backed by the team and by both of the drivers, Lewis in particular has stated prior to this that he wants Fred to stay. And when Lewis was asked about this, he did say that it was distracting to the team and that the rumors were overall frustrating because not only had he backed Fred, we'd also seen the team say that they want to stick with him. But I do honestly think that this rumor doesn't really have any teeth, and maybe I'll eat my words at the end of the season, maybe we'll have another shock announcement, but it would be kind of a shock to me to see Fred ousted and see Christian replace him. What I will say is that it's no surprise that Christian is having these conversations and trying to find his way back into the sport. Whether or not anything will come from it, whether or not we'll see something come from it this season, whether or not that would be something further down the line, all of those are things that are up in the air, but it's not surprising that he's trying to make his way back in. And then, of course, we have the very public lawsuit between McLaren and an IndyCar driver. That IndyCar driver is Alex Palou, and the lawsuit technically isn't directly to the Formula One team. In fact, McLaren is the one suing Alex Palou. And I'm not going to go through all of the particulars of this case in this episode. If people do want to break down and want to request that, I'd be happy to kind of go through one, though I will say I'm not a lawyer, so all of my understanding of this case is just through the reporting that's being done. The biggest issue that I think McLaren is having with this case is that the timing is real bad. Just to put it simply, right now, so many people are heavily looking at the way McLaren treats their Formula One drivers, and it's something that we're talking about almost every week on this podcast. McLaren right now is heavily being criticized for favoring favoring one driver over another. And depending on which side of the internet or fandom you are on, you will see that people perceive that kind of favoritism to be for one driver or the other. There's not a complete consensus over it, but after Singapore and heading into Texas, Oscar Piastri was maybe not someone that McLaren wanted any bad press around. And unfortunately for them, this lawsuit absolutely brought a bunch of headlines that definitely go against Oscar. Basically, the short version of this case is that McLaren is suing Alex Palou for breach of contract. Before Oscar Piastri was signed as a McLaren driver, back when he was actually working with Alpine, Alex Palou agreed to leave his seat at Chip Ganassi Racing in IndyCar and head over to McLaren's IndyCar outfit. However, he ultimately breached that contract and refused to race for McLaren. Alex actually decided to stay with Chip Ganassi Racing, where he continued to win championships, and McLaren is suing him for this breach of contract to the tune of over $20 million. They're saying that the breach of this contract cost them money not only in the fact that they didn't have a top-level driver in that seat, and that they had to kind of rotate that seat through a number of drivers, testing different people out, and ultimately settling on a driver named Nolan Siegel. This, they said, not only cost them money in terms of wins and in terms of the future of their team, but also in the fact that they had signed major sponsors with the idea that Alex Palou would be the representation of the team, and that those sponsors were signing on at such a high price to be represented by a champion. And that seems like a pretty open and shut case. Alex Palou signed a contract, he breached it, and now he owes the team damages. However, what has come out in this lawsuit going to court is also the part that is not necessarily great for McLaren's image in Formula One right now. Alex Palou maintains that yes, he did breach his contract. However, the only reason he signed a contract in the first place was that Zak Brown had made it clear that he would be considered for a Formula One seat. At that time, McLaren's driver pairing was actually Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. And if you're new to the world of Formula One and you weren't watching back then, Daniel Ricciardo, despite being so successful at other teams, was very much struggling at McLaren, and it was becoming clear within the team that they were not intending to renew Daniel's contract. During this moment in time, Alex Palou is contacted about coming over to McLaren, and Alex Palou maintains that Zak Brown told him that he would be up for that seat when Daniel Ricciardo inevitably needed to leave and they needed to make a change for the team. Alex basically talks about the fact that he never would have signed a contract with McLaren for IndyCar if he had not had the impression that he would be considered for the Formula One seat. McLaren came back and said that they never said that. There was no promise of a Formula One seat, and that while they did say that they would have things like testing for Alex, as well as the opportunity to drive in free practice sessions, they never said anything about him getting a Formula One seat, and that this was a contract for IndyCar. But the biggest headline that you may have seen come out of this is that when Oscar Piastri was announced as the driver for McLaren to replace Daniel Ricciardo, Alex Palou maintains that in his shock, he contacted Zak, very upset that McLaren had now signed a new rookie that was not Alex, and that he felt that that seat was something that he was entitled to, or at least being considered for. And to be so clear about what's going on here, everything I'm about to say is what Alex Palou maintains happened. Alex says that at this point, Zak Brown tells him he never wanted Oscar in the seat, and that he was not the one that made that decision. Additionally, other things have come out that imply that Zak Brown was actually using this seat to make other relationships in IndyCar with other drivers as well, and that other drivers were surprised to see Oscar announced in this shock way. If you don't remember, one of the biggest shocks that went through the paddock that season was the fact that Alpine announced that Oscar Piastri would be driving for them the following season, and Oscar then tweeted saying, "I never said that. And not only did I never say that, I'm definitely not doing it." That tweet has become one of the most famous tweets in motorsports, I believe, and is constantly memed and utilized even outside of the world of Formula One. However, Alex Palou maintains that that tweet and subsequently the announcement of Oscar Piastri as the new driver was very shocking to him, and that when he brought it to Zak, Zak said that he did not want Oscar in the seat. I do want to be very clear that Zak has since denied this. He also talked about the fact that the idea that he wouldn't be the one to make a decision for the McLaren Formula One team as CEO is ridiculous, and the idea that he would not have wanted someone as talented as Oscar on the team is also ridiculous. And honestly, I want to say I don't know who's telling the truth here, and we really only have hearsay, but unfortunately, the reason that we only have hearsay is that it has been revealed that McLaren has a company policy of making their WhatsApp messages delete after 7 days. This means that there is a ton of records that we don't have, and that we don't really have a way to prove who said what, given the fact that anything done in writing actually is being disappeared. This is a setting that you can put on WhatsApp that basically just means you don't actually have records of any of these conversations. And I will say that that does feel like an odd company policy. I've never run a Formula One team. I've never run a multi kind of car corporation. one. I do think it is a surprise that they are having their company policy be that we should keep no records of our conversations at any time. It's a complicated court case, and I don't necessarily want to get into all of the particulars about it, but I think the most important thing is that this was just bad timing for McLaren in terms of PR. Right now, we're in this massive conversation every week about how McLaren is not treating their drivers properly, how they're favoring one driver over the other, and the conversation in Singapore was very much that Oscar Piastri didn't seem to be the favorite child. And it's not a great look for all of the headlines between last weekend and this weekend to basically read, whether true or not, Zak Brown never wanted Oscar Piastri on the team in the first place. I think the case is quite interesting, and maybe I will do a full breakdown if people are interested, but I do think that the biggest thing that has come out of this is just bad timing. Whether it's true, whether it's not, it kind of doesn't matter in the court of public opinion, and it also doesn't matter when the court of public opinion was already so far slated against Zak Brown and McLaren and their treatment of Oscar. And so I think that this coming out, especially at this time, was just a rough way to enter the weekend. And of course, speaking of contracts, right before this weekend started, Mercedes officially announced that their driver lineup is staying exactly the same for 2026. Both George Russell and Kimi Antonelli have officially been renewed for at least one more season. And while we don't know the actual particulars of either of their contracts, whether they go past 2026, the amount of money that they have, and also whether or not there's an exit clause for both of them, we do know that George Russell wanted to stay with Mercedes, in that he seems to be generally happy about his contract. When asked about it, he did say that contracts are a personal matter and he didn't want to discuss it, but we do know that the rumor mill says that it's possible that George will actually be the third highest paid driver on the grid next season with this contract. If I were to take a guess, I would say that probably both Kimi and George only are guaranteed one season. We do have a contract type called a 1-in-1, where one season is guaranteed and the next season is an option for both the team and the driver to exercise, but also usually both the team and the driver have an option to exit the contract at that point. I think we're going into kind of an interesting season with 2026 with the regulations changing, and with the rumor mill and everyone at Mercedes seeming pretty certain that they will be the ones that really understand the regulations when the season starts. With that being said, we also know that there has been this conversation about Mercedes looking out for another possible driver, and Max Verstappen has always been that topic of conversation. There was a large portion of this season where we thought that Max actually might break his contract and head over to Mercedes for 2026. However, it does make sense that Max would want to wait through 1 year and see how the regulations actually shake out, which teams actually know what they're doing and which teams have more work to do. And with that being the case, if Max is trying to wait out his options, it also means that Toto may want that door open. We already know that that was kind of the case with Lewis Hamilton's contract. Toto and Mercedes wanted the option to bring Kimi Antonelli up when they felt he was ready. And because of that, they had a contract where Lewis was able to exit early. And that's exactly what he did to head over to Ferrari. That resulted in Kimi Antonelli coming up into that seat right now. And while he hasn't had the best performance and he has made some mistakes, he also does show all the signs of being a very strong and pretty intensely good driver moving forward. I think Kimi Antonelli has shown the spark of a driver who is ultimately going to be a very great driver. And so while they took this risk of losing Lewis Hamilton, they did so while banking on the future of Mercedes. And I will be honest with you, I think if Max Verstappen is a conversation, they're probably willing to take that same risk with both George and Kimi next season. And a little conspiracy theory, if things at McLaren continue to be a little shaky, there's always the possibility that Oscar Piastri, a driver who has been very championed by a number of team principals, may want to jump ship. All of that being said, the Mercedes driver lineup is officially locked in, and silly season has kind of been an uneventful one. It's been rather unsilly. I don't want to say serious, which I guess would be sort of the antonym of that, but silly season in general has been not very silly at all. And while it is a bummer, it also makes sense. I think we're moving into a regulation change that is going to need a little bit of stability where you can find it. The biggest place that we'll be looking now is that second Red Bull seat, as well as both of the V-carb seats, and it will really be a question of who's staying, who's shuffling, and who's going to sit next to Max Verstappen next season. At the start of this race weekend, we also saw the announcement of something called grid gigs, and that, I will say, is a bit of a mouthful. It is hard to get it out every time I try to talk about it. It's just a tongue twister. Grid gigs is, I want to say like gligs or clicks, or there's a lot of options that are not the correct term, but grid gigs is an interesting concept to me. I talked a little bit about this on all of my social media platforms when it was first announced, but it does feel like a mini attempt at a Super Bowl halftime show. Grid gigs are official concerts that will be taking place on the grid prior to the start of the race. It does not replace any commentary, which I saw a lot of people thinking that it did. It also doesn't happen during during the race. It's just an opportunity for them to have an additional sponsorship slot because this is presented by American Express, and also a different opportunity to have a big musical artist make a big kind of flashy show that attracts new viewers. Whether or not this will turn into something big, Formula One did say that this is an attempt to kind of bring in the same level of viewership that they had at F175. For reference, in the US specifically, which is relevant for the Apple TV deal that I will touch on, the viewership on ESPN is going up, but it is very much not the most favorite sport watched in the US. Average viewership in the US is up to about 1.4 million viewers, which is significantly lower than a lot of other sports. I think the intention behind these grid gigs is twofold. They won't be at every race, but they do present an interesting opportunity to bring new entertainment to the grid, to have a sort of extra entertainment slot in the race weekend itself, and also to bring a little bit more star power and hopefully new viewership. F175, for example, which was this sort of flashy big event that also had musical acts, did bring in 7.1 million viewers plus everyone that was actually physically in the O2. And so it does make sense that F1 would look at those numbers and say, how can we sort of replicate that weekend over weekend? Grid gigs, which are these small produced concerts that will happen before the race, do seem to be an interesting kind of take on that. Personally, for me, I don't think it detracts from the race at all. It may be a sort of odd slot to have, but it doesn't change any of the commentary. It doesn't change any of what's actually going on at the race weekend itself. And it's kind of an interesting way to bring in new stars to the grid and maybe bring in a viewer or two. If you have someone like Adele who's going to sing 2 songs before the race, maybe you get a couple of new viewers that come in and stay for the race itself. I think it's pretty harmless. I think it's kind of fun. And I think people may disagree with that, but I also think that sometimes it's okay for sports to evolve and change, especially when they don't actually affect the sport itself. But I'm curious how you guys feel about grid gigs, because I did find that when I first talked about it, a lot of people were actually pretty against it. And I am curious if people realize that it doesn't affect the racing or the broadcast of the racing at all. It's just an additional thing that's going on. And of course, we also had the announcement of the Apple TV deal. Apple TV will be taking over the broadcast rights of Formula One in the United States starting in 2026. And while this rumor was pretty much known to be fact for a while before it was announced, a lot of the conversation was, what was it going to look like? Was it going to be an additional subscription cost? And would there be F1 TV still in the US? And we do have a lot of those answers now. Any Apple TV subscription will now include Formula One without a premium upgrade, and F1 TV will be remaining in the United States. Apple's actual F1 coverage is set to be a mix of Sky Sports and F1 TV commentators and talent, and F1 TV Premium will also be included as part of your subscription when you subscribe to Apple TV. If you already have F1 TV and you pay for it on an annual subscription, you will still have access to your F1 TV subscription through the end of the month that you paid for annually. So for me, I will have access to F1 TV Premium all the way through, I think, September or something like that. After that, you can subscribe to Apple TV, which will include F1 TV Premium. And if you compare the actual price points, F1 TV Premium costs more per month and annually than an Apple TV subscription costs on its own. And to be clear, I got all of this information literally from the press release and the subscriber email that they sent to current F1 TV subscribers. I do think there's a lot of misinformation about this deal, and I think people have been reacting very intensely to it. But to me, as someone who's worked in both television and kind of covering Formula One for so long, I honestly think that this is going to be an interesting growth strategy for Formula One in the United States. A number of the races will be available for free on Apple TV, regardless of whether you actually pay for a subscription. A number of people actually get Apple TV for free with their cell phone kind of plan. You should check that if you don't know. You may actually have Apple TV already included in something else that you're paying for. And while I do understand if people are upset that they pay for cable and have access to ESPN and will no longer have access to the races, I do think a lot of people have cut the cord, and that this is a pretty interesting opportunity for F1 to be in front of more viewers. They've also said that they intend to try to promote the sport across the entirety of their programs, meaning like the collaborations that we saw with the F1 movie, also the collaborations we saw with Apple Maps, and we'll probably see some enhancements when it comes to Apple News, when it comes to actual Formula One coverage. I also think that it's a great way to get in front of a lot of other people, and of course for Apple, they're going to drive subscriber growth. If you're paying for F1 TV, you'll still get access to F1 TV Premium for a lower cost than F1 TV Premium costs you right now, and I think Apple is going to invest in a lot of things like different camera angles like they did for the movie, and there's an opportunity, if Apple is actually heavily invested in the sport itself with their own personal financial gain, for that to turn into something that could be pretty innovative for the sport as a whole. I think for me, as someone who has Apple TV and F1 TV, obviously I'm now cutting one of those costs, and that's a positive in my opinion, but people are entitled to feel however they feel about this deal. To me, I actually think it's a good one. I think we're going to see some really interesting partnerships and changes that come from Apple being involved. I think the F1 movie made some interesting new fans that were excited to see the sport. I think they also shot shot it in a way that was really interesting, innovative, and could be applied to broadcast as a whole. And I think because of the fact that Apple has so many different angles that they're going to come at this with, we may end up getting some really cool behind the scenes and kind of onboard footage that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. I think for me, the core takeaway is F1 TV is not going away in the US. Those of you who are using a cable subscription to access ESPN and do not pay for F1 TV as an additional service, obviously will have to make a change. And I do think Apple is ultimately going to invest in growing the fan base in the US, as well as probably ancillary content like the F1 movie, like other F1 shows that we could see, whether that's scripted content, unscripted content. They do have an entire streaming service and a lot of money behind it that they could actually invest in more programming. I think there could be a lot of interesting innovation that comes out of camera angles, out of technology that Apple will now be able to share with F1 as a whole. Overall, this partnership actually has the potential to be a really good thing. I'm not saying that everyone has to be happy about it. I'm not saying that it's the perfect decision or the perfect solution or that we know everything about this deal just yet, but I am saying that I think this is probably the most interesting kind of partnership that we could have seen, and that it is the way that sports are moving in this direction. If you watch any other sport in the US right now, it's very much spread out across multiple platforms. The NBA, for example, I believe is actually airing on 4 different networks and platforms right now. The NHL is also split across a multitude of different options of how to watch them. Various different sports require so many different streaming platforms just to watch your own team's games, and the ability to be able to keep F1 in one single location, to still have the ability to access F1 TV if that is the preferred way that you've been watching it, which is for me the same way, having the access to the premium features, which is what it sounds like it will have, and potentially continuing to see a growing audience. I think this makes sense, and I think it is just the direction that sports are going, whether you like it or not. I also will say that I saw a number of people saying that F1 has now been put behind a paywall for the first time, and I do want to reiterate that ESPN is not and never has been free. There are a couple of races every year that I believe air on ABC for free, and that will be the same thing with Apple TV. All practice sessions as well as a number of races throughout the season will be available for free even if you don't subscribe to Apple TV. But other than that, ESPN has always been a paywall. It's just a different type of paywall. ESPN comes through either having a cable subscription, which you pay a large amount of money for, or from subscribing to ESPN Plus or one of the Disney bundles. All of that being said, this is not the first time F1 is being moved behind a paywall in the US. It is the first time that it's specifically being moved behind the Apple paywall. And I genuinely do think a lot of the outrage is coming from people who didn't fully read their F1 email from their F1 TV subscription, who are reading headlines because people want clickbait, and who maybe don't understand that F1 TV is not going away. It's just that F1 Premium is now being rolled into Apple and that you will get your F1 TV through Apple. As a whole, I think this is the smallest amount of disruption that we would see from it moving to a streaming platform, and objectively, I do think it has the opportunity to help grow the sport in the US, which is the goal. All of that being said, you can have your own feelings about this, and we also don't know everything yet, but I did get a lot of people sending me messages and asking questions about this Apple TV deal, and so I thought I would try to break it down as simple as possible. And then moving on to just a couple of pre-race kind of news things that we saw that did end up affecting the weekend. The FIA declared their second heat advisory in history, which I've talked a lot about what this means, but just a refresher in case you're new to the podcast or you're new to Formula One. In 2023, during the Qatar Grand Prix, the heat conditions were so intense that a number of drivers got intensely ill. And after that, where we saw drivers report that they threw up in their helmets from heat exhaustion, that they passed out while driving, that they had to be helped out of their cars after the race, and also that Logan Sargent physically had to retire from the race early due to heat concerns. We saw the FIA say that they were going to work on a new system that was going to be a little bit more safe and trying to figure out how they could regulate these issues. We didn't see anything kind of come out of that last season, but this season, prior to everything starting, we saw the FIA say that they have this new thing called a heat advisory. When the FIA does declare a heat advisory for the actual weekend, it means that the driver cooling system has to be fitted to the cars. The driver cooling system is basically a bunch of pumps that go together. This is a very simple explanation of this, to be clear, but essentially we have a unit that is fitted to the car that has tubes that go into the squiggly vest that you may have seen drivers wearing this weekend, and takes coolant liquid and pumps it through the system into the vest, which should, in theory, cool the driver's core temperature down as they continue to race. And it's important to understand that that's how it's supposed to work, as we did see that it came up a couple of different times this weekend. This year, because the system is still being figured out, drivers do have the option to not wear the cooling system. However, when a heat advisory is declared, the weight requirements of the car is upped, which means that if drivers decide not to utilize the driver cooling system because they personally don't want to, Max Verstappen, for example, says that the tubes are very uncomfortable with the belts on top of it. Other drivers after Singapore said that the driver cooling system didn't work for a very long period of time, where they only got a couple of laps of benefits and that it then became a little bit irritating to have on you. It's sort of a mixed bag on how drivers are feeling about it. So if a driver elects not to utilize the driver cooling system during a heat advisory weekend, right now they still have to meet that weight requirement, which means that they're going to add ballast or extra weight to the car to be able to hit that if they don't include the driver cooling system itself. So a heat advisory had been declared for COTA, which meant that drivers had to choose between utilizing the cooling system or adding extra weight to the car. And the last little piece of news heading into this race weekend, before COTA started, we had 5 drivers still in mathematical contention for the championship. Those were Oscar Piastri, who leads the championship, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, George Russell, and Charles Leclerc. And after Max has had this insane performance over the last couple of races, Max was heading into this weekend with a real conversation about whether or not he could still fight for this driver's championship. And it's important to know that heading into this race weekend, with 6 race weekends left in the schedule, he needed to outscore Oscar Piastri by an average of 10.5 points per weekend. Keep that number in mind as we go through the rest of the race weekend and talk about what happened here. So that covers kind of everything that started before the race weekend started and a couple of things that came out in media day. Let's talk about the race weekend itself. This was a sprint race weekend, which meant that we only had one free practice session. And relatively, that free practice session was uneventful. The only moment that super comes to mind is Hajar having to deal with his race engineer telling him that Valtteri Bottas was on track in front of him, which obviously was not the case, and Isaac really reacted pretty strongly to that. But otherwise, we just saw these drivers kind of running a session. There was a little bit of wind to contend with, and COTA is particularly bumpy, and so this was the only session that drivers and teams had to really gather data and to get a feel on that track. And it's important to know that sprint race weekends really affect the actual data collection that you would normally have in a 3 practice weekend. Instead of having 3 free practice sessions, we have 1 free practice session, and then sprint qualifying and the sprint race itself actually replace those other 2 sessions. And so the sprint race is not only important for the minimal amount of points that are available, but it's actually also important for drivers and teams to test out tires, strategies, and setups before they head into qualifying later that day and the Grand Prix itself on Sunday. And I always think that that makes a race weekend a little bit more intense. Some people are really split about whether or not they like sprint races because it gets rid of that data, and also sometimes when you have such an exciting sprint race, it means that the race itself is not that exciting, or a sprint race might telegraph what's going to happen in the race itself, and then that becomes less exciting too. For me, I kind of enjoy the chaos that it brings to a weekend. I think that sprint races also add a little bit to your experience if you actually go to the track, because it's an extra day of excitement, an extra day of racing, and then there's a little bit different kind of energy than you would have just from a standard race weekend. Plus, like we're seeing this weekend, those extra points on the table can be a really big deal for a close title fight. So let's get into sprint qualifying. This was a tough one for Yuki, again, because of strategy. We have seen a couple of times this season with Red Bull where Yuki just gets sent out at the last minute and just does not have the time to get in enough laps to actually be able to really qualify and move forward. This was a tough one. We did see the team later apologize to Yuki, but this is also a mistake that's been made a couple of times with Yuki himself. And I think it's a tough one because Yuki himself really is fighting for his spot next year. Right now, rumor has it that Isaac is going to be promoted into that Red Bull seat, that we'll see a Red Bull Junior, most likely Arvid Lindblad, come into VCARB, and that final seat at VCARB will be filled with either Yuki or Liam, and that we're seeing them kind of evaluate performance for the rest of the season to make that decision. And so it's tough for Yuki to have these moments where it feels like team strategy really pushes him to the back of the pack, and he may have been able to prove something different had he actually had the chance to get a good lap in. I personally really like Yuki, and I'd like to see him stay on the grid, and so every time one of these moments happen, I'm just so frustrated for him. And it is tough to watch because I always wonder, especially with how Red Bull has changed so much in the last couple of seasons, but especially this season, if the driver in the second seat really has ever had a chance to prove themselves worthy of it. And if we're kind of getting this weird moment now where midway through the season, things are changing, Yuki's getting the same car setup, things aren't being held back for Max, but it almost feels like it's too late for Yuki to have enough time to really prove himself, and that sometimes these little moments, these little strategy issues come up, and then we struggle to see what his performance really could be. Yuki was really the heartbreak of SQ1 for me. We had 2 drivers DNF, those were Liam Lawson and Gabriel Bortoleto, and then we had Kimi Antonelli just barely bumped out at the end of SQ2, and so he didn't go on to SQ3. But those cooling vests I mentioned, we found out later that part of his problem during sprint qualifying was actually the cooling vest. Kimi did have the cooling vest on underneath his suit, but he said that it was malfunctioning, and so instead of actually cooling him down, it was heating him up more. And this is a system that, because it's fitted to the car, isn't something that you can change in between qualifying sessions. And it's not something that he could have taken off or just taken the vest off or deactivated it. So because of that, there's this issue where he decided to utilize the cooling vest as the drivers were supposed to, but then he ends up having a major disadvantage of having his body actually heated up while he's trying to get through sprint sprint qualifying at a very intense rate. So we see Kimi just barely knocked out, and we see both Ferraris actually go through to SQ3. But unfortunately, we still were sort of seeing this disappointing, lackluster performance, and they only just barely kind of bring the car across the line, with Charles Leclerc qualifying 10th and Lewis qualifying 8th. Nico Hülkenberg takes a surprise 4th position, and that was very exciting to me because honestly, especially since his podium in Silverstone, I've been so hopeful that we would get to see some really cool, exciting performance from him, and this was really fun. I do think that as we kind of start to talk about next year, Sauber is turning into Audi, and they have this driver lineup of Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto. Gabby is quite young and quite talented as we've seen his performance continue to improve, this kind of conversation about sprint qualifying aside, and Nico is very experienced and kind of a great example of a driver who could be great but didn't ever have the right machinery. And so I'm interested to see what they look like when the actual Audi banner takes over and we move forward into this new regulation season. Because I do think they have the driver lineup. And if they could get the machinery, it could be really interesting to see what kind of a threat that these drivers can pose to the rest of the field. Because Nico is managing these massive random moments, and Gabby is also consistently increasing his performance and having sudden good performance as well, where we see him qualify in the top 10. If they actually have pretty good machinery next year, I'm quite interested to see what that looks like. So Max takes pole position, and just behind him we have Lando Norris and then Oscar Piastri, which as we're looking at it, we're thinking, okay, we're gonna get a really cool title battle fight for this. And oh boy, is there a twist to that feeling. Let's get into the sprint race itself. Now, the sprint race itself was obviously very chaotic from the very beginning, but I do think it's important to talk about the start and talk about kind of like what the actual reaction was, because as we just discussed, Max Verstappen was up on pole, Lando Norris was in 2nd, Oscar Piastri was in 3rd, and unexpectedly, Nico Hülkenberg was in 4th. And when we actually started the race, Max very critically got away from everyone else quickly. He had a very good start off the line, and by the time we got to turn 1, he was enough out of the way that nothing really would have affected him. And so when we get into this massive turn 1 chaos of Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, and Nico Hülkenberg all getting taken out in one fell swoop, Max just benefits from it. He doesn't have to worry about getting around everyone else. He doesn't have to worry about avoiding action. And all of that comes down to getting a good start. I also think one of my biggest frustrations in the moment was hearing Zach Brown call Nico Hülkenberg an amateur. He said this wasn't the fault of either of the drivers, it was amateur hour. And my frustration with that is that Nico Hülkenberg is very obviously a very well-seasoned driver. He knows what he's doing, and we've seen throughout these weekends, especially this year, like as I talked about earlier, when he's given a chance, he actually does push a car all the way to the front, and he knows what he's doing when it comes to driving. Also, Nico Hülkenberg is a driver who has had to fight from the back, has had to deal with making sure he doesn't hit other people, has had to take avoiding action, manages to get himself into the points, and I think a lot of times we forget because drivers are not at a top-level team, that doesn't mean that they are not a top-level driver. And so for some reason, using that word amateur really put me off. I just think it's great. You have two drivers that are leading the world championship. Your youngest driver, who's only in his 3rd season of Formula One, is leading the championship. That's great. But calling a seasoned driver an amateur in the heat of the moment also made me wonder, is this why a lot of the times we're getting these heated moments from Lando and Oscar that really turn into these viral moments? If the CEO of your team is also saying kind of wild things in the heat of the moment without having a chance to actually review and see what happened, which ultimately, after he saw it, said that he shouldn't have said what he said about Nico, is that why we're seeing so much reactionary commentary from Oscar and Lando? Does that kind of fit the culture of McLaren? I do think that as I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, McLaren has encouraged the type of behavior that we're getting from their drivers, and that this idea of fairness continues to affect performance in an odd way that isn't really necessary. And I also think that we're now seeing additionally kind of this McLaren emotional outburst without taking time to look at the facts, without taking time to kind of think things through, just speaking from your frustration. And we're seeing that not only just from the drivers, but all the way up across the board to Zach. And ultimately, he did say he shouldn't have said it, and so we'll let it go. But I think that there is this element of reacting before you even watch the tape to realize what happened. And what happened ultimately was just a racing incident. I think there's been a lot of different conversation about this. Some people have felt that this was Oscar's fault because he did try to attempt a switchback, and in that portion of the race, he should have known that there were other cars that were going to be close and wouldn't have been able to kind of take avoiding action. I do think, again, he was trying to race, and that is fair, and also that he wouldn't have been able to see all the way that Alonso was going to come up and kind of make that car situation situation 3 cars wide. That's also something that I do think a lot of us missed. I missed it in my first watch of the race. Not only did Nico and Oscar collide, which ultimately led to Oscar colliding with Lando and taking all 3 of them out of the race, Fernando Alonso was on the other side of Nico and did actually make contact in that same splash. But ultimately, we didn't actually see it in the moment, and we may have missed it because Fernando was not one of the cars that immediately retired. He did retire as a result of that contact, and so I think it just got kind of missed in the heat of the moment and in the chaos of this movement. But I also think it's hard to say that Oscar should have known that there was potentially going to be 3 cars wide. I really do think, as the stewards ultimately ruled, that this was a racing incident and it wasn't anyone's fault. I also think that as you get into this moment of really fighting for the championship, drivers are not going to be driving necessarily the most cautiously. And I think that this moment of him trying to make a good move and finding that it wouldn't pay off for him did affect his racing and the way that he was going about it for the rest of the weekend, which was unfortunate. However, this chaos did make room for one of my biggest stars of the weekend, Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda ultimately had a pretty disappointing qualifying, as we talked about, and that was because of the strategy that we saw Red Bull apologize for. However, Yuki managed to really take advantage of this turn 1 chaos and immediately makes up a huge number of positions by not only avoiding the kind of chaos that he would have crashed into, but also literally driving over Nico Hülkenberg's front wing and managing to take up all of these places as he goes around them. Luckily, his car managed to do that without taking big damage, but it was a risky move that ultimately ended in him actually having a great sprint weekend. Yuki started the sprint race in 18th and ended in 7th, which put him in the points, which is even harder to do during the sprint, given the fact that only the top 8 drivers receive points. I was really impressed with this. I know I've kind of been a Yuki champion for a little bit, and I really like Yuki, but I also really like moments like this where Yuki actually gets a chance to show what he can do, and also where he stops kind of counting himself out when he qualifies so far down, which was something that we were seeing earlier on in his Red Bull kind of tenure that he's had this year. I think the changes that we've seen Red Bull absolutely make and admit to making, including giving Yuki all of the actual same setups and upgrades that Max has had, and actually really focusing on having 2 drivers in the garage, finally getting a chance to see what Yuki can do and seeing weekends like this where he does a great job is really exciting to me. And so if we had had a driver of the day for the sprint race, honestly, for me, it would have been Yuki. Also, the other thing I will say about this weekend as a whole, I actually felt the broadcast was a lot better. We talked about this in Singapore, and we talked about Carlos Sainz actually kind of calling out the F1 broadcast, saying that they're showing too many girlfriends, celebrities, partners, and that they're not actually showing the racing, and that people feel like we're actively missing out on the racing itself. There was the Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso battle that we missed out on, but this weekend I actually felt like we got a lot of mid-grid coverage, and we actually got to see a lot of what was going on, and I was really happy with the changes we saw. And in the sprint, we do see a little bit of chaos in the back. Lance Stroll and Esteban Ocon kind of clash into each other and ultimately both have to retire, but for some reason Lance just keeps driving. I noticed that and I thought, like, why are we doing this? Why are we pulling out? What's going on? Lance lately has been having some weird moments. This was just another one of them, and ultimately we did see both of them retire. And then I was kind of impressed with George and his actual sprint race run. I thought it was surprising to see how close he was able to get to Max and the pressure that he was able to put on him. Ultimately, I wasn't necessarily worried that Max was not going to win the race or that George was going to pass him, but I do think we're continually seeing this performance from George that does seem to increase. And it is interesting. I've seen a lot of people talk about the fact that, like, no matter what George does, he never really gets any attention. Even when he wins a race, there's always something more interesting going on than George actually winning. And sometimes I do find myself skipping over it as well. And I do think that George actually is having a great couple of weekends. Obviously, he won in Singapore, and then we see him get this big contract renewal. And then on the sprint race, there were moments where I thought, like, next season, the title battle might be between George and Max. And if so, what does that look like and how interesting does that become? And if we're watching them go head to head next year, which one of them ends up at Mercedes? I'm just going to put that out there. Ultimately, we obviously see Max take the win and George and Carlos join him on the podium. But ultimately, we got to see Tara Davis Woodhall and her husband, Hunter Woodhall. Tara is an Olympian and Hunter is a Paralympian. And Tara is actually from Texas. I really like both of them, and I thought it was really cool to see them present these belt buckles to the sprint race podium. And I will say, a lot of people didn't know who they were, and it did sometimes make me wonder, like, what if F1 actually did a little package about the people who are presenting the pole position award or the actual kind of podium awards. It would be kind of cool, especially when it's like Team USA athletes like this, to be able to know a little bit about who they are and why they are presenting the trophies. Though obviously there's not always the most interesting person or the most interesting story doing it, but I still think it could be cool. It could have been a cool way to kind of highlight these people and to kind of cross over sports in general. The same way we see actors kind of do these things to promote the movies that they have coming out. Glenn Powell was there with Running Man coming out soon. In general, I think it just could be kind of a cool way to actually see why these people are here and why they're doing it. But obviously the F1 broadcast has existed for a long time and it's just a small note. One thing I did want to point out, because I've gotten a lot of questions about this, is why do we sometimes see sprint race kind of performance not translate in the same way to actual race performance? And there's a number of reasons for that, but mostly it's the fact that the race itself is so much shorter that cars are running a little bit differently. They're not running as much fuel as they are at the start of a Grand Prix, because in Formula One, we never refuel. So there's just enough fuel in the car for that Grand Prix or for that sprint race. Obviously, a sprint race is shorter, which means that it needs less fuel, which means that the cars in general are lighter at the very start of the race. Also, the other thing is that tire strategy is not as big of a factor here. And we don't do pit stops in this race. It was only 19 laps. There's not a rule that you can't do a pit stop, but you would essentially definitely lose the race if you did one. And there's no need to, because of how short these races are. And remember what we talked about when it comes to losing 2 free practice sessions. The sprint race and sprint qualifying are still times for those teams to be gathering data that they can't get from free practice. So we saw everyone go out on a medium, but one major difference was that a couple of drivers actually went out on used mediums. Every weekend, drivers have a limited amount of each compound that they can utilize, and each compound, they have an idea of how many laps it's going to last them. So a tire that they might have used in free practice or sprint qualifying doesn't have the full wear on that tire, but may be rubbed in a little bit. As we ended up seeing in the Grand Prix, the medium tire itself ended up being the most important tire to start the race on, and we saw that they were able to go for a number of laps past 19. So by utilizing a tire that's already been used a little bit, but not to the full length of that tire, they maintain fresh compounds for later in the weekend for both qualifying and the actual race itself. But they also have a tire that already kind of has a little bit of rubber taken off, which means that they can plan for that performance and get a little bit of data of what that tire looks like in the race. So in the sprint, we actually saw Hajar, Antonelli, Leclerc, Stroll, Lawson, Hamilton, and George Russell go out on a used medium. So all of these factors that are a little bit different in the sprint itself, those are going to be different conditions when we go into the Grand Prix, which means you're not always going to see the same people perform exactly the same way. So for me, actually, I think the sprint race was probably the most exciting in terms of chaos for the weekend. Let's get into qualifying and the Grand Prix itself. For me, the sprint race was definitely the most exciting out of the entire weekend. And also, as we said, going into this weekend, if Max wanted to continue his kind of championship run, he needed to outscore Oscar by 10.5 points for the entire weekend. Because of Oscar and Lando both crashing out in the sprint race, both of them earned 0 of the points that were available to them there. And so Max walks away from the sprint with 8 points out of the 10.5 points that he needed to score. So Max walks out of the sprint with a full 8 points ahead of Oscar, needing to only score another 2.5 gap in the Grand Prix itself. So that covers the sprint portion of the weekend. Let's get into qualifying and the Grand Prix. Qualifying, unfortunately, starts out pretty quickly with a tough break for Isaac Hajar. We see him go into the wall, the session is red flagged, and also we see him not only hitting the actual steering wheel of the car, but also hitting his helmet. I really feel weirdly protective of Isaac. I feel like so much of that started just because of how his season started in Australia, but also because I think he's a really good driver, and I think he's really taken to Formula One in a way that has been so impressive. And so it's always tough to watch someone be so hard on themselves in a situation like that. But also, of course, you're being hard on yourself. This is literally your job, and it sucks to not be able to do it to the caliber that you want to be. And also to kind of like the level that I think people have started to expect from Isaac. A crash out in Q1 early on is really surprising from him. But we do know that this track is quite bumpy, quite windy, and the conditions were just not the best this weekend. And so qualifying ended up being tough for Isaac. That crash was also so early on that nobody had put any times up at that point. And so it means that everyone was sort of hitting the track at the same disadvantage almost, which I do think is sometimes a very big difference when we have a red flagged qualifying session. If you already have a lap in, it means that you kind of come in at an advantage already. But at this point, everybody was sort of at the same level of disadvantage by the stoppage. And then we sort of had some surprising back and forth from qualifying. Saw a number of different cars, including at one point Hulk again going very fast. But we also ultimately end up seeing Max on top, and at a certain point got a little nervous that Lando may not get a proper lap in, but ultimately he does make it through. And this was also where track limits started to be a big issue in this weekend. If you're not familiar with track limits or you're new to the world of car go fast, track limits is actually a requirement of you staying within those thick white lines on the track. If a driver takes all four wheels of their car over those thick white lines, they get what's called a track limits violation. In qualifying, if that happens, your lap time is immediately deleted. And that's what we saw happen with Alex Albon at the end of this qualifying run. Unfortunately, he ends up putting in this really fast time, but then as we're watching the lap, there are moments where it looks like he's pitching himself all the way to the edge, and in fact, he did violate track limits on that lap time. Now, track limits can be kind of confusing because they're not fully explained during the broadcast, but basically, if you take your car all four wheels over that white line and you go outside of the track limits, you then, in qualifying, have your lap time deleted, and it's a little bit different in the Grand Prix, which we also saw become an issue this weekend. Every driver can make a maximum of 3 track limits violation during a Grand Prix, and once you do the 4th, you get a 5-second time penalty. If you do it a 5th time, you actually get a 10-second time penalty, and that's during the race itself. So in qualifying, it can be a really big kind of make or break issue because, like we saw with Alex Albon here, you're getting to the end of your session, you're really trying to make it through, you push your final lap really hard, and then ultimately you end up kind of getting yourself into a situation where you don't have time to go for another lap. This can sometimes be a situation where you're just put under more pressure, but this was literally the last lap that Alex had a chance to do and therefore gets knocked out. So in Q1, we lose Isaac to the wall, Alex to track limits, and then Lance Stroll, Esteban Ocon, and Gabriel Bortoleto. In Q2, we lose Franco Colapinto and Pierre Gasly. Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson also get knocked out here. And that was also a situation where we saw Yuki over the radio say that Liam was intentionally blocking him and impeding him to try to make his qualifying session tougher. We did see Liam actually address that later and say that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And it's an interesting dynamic right now that I think is going to continue to heat up for the rest of the season, because it does seem like Liam and Yuki are up against each other for one final seat inside that Red Bull V-Carb camp. And I think we're going to continue to see the tension between the two of them rise and potentially see little moments like this where, whether it's intentional or not, one driver feels that the other driver is intentionally trying to impede their performance. The last driver knocked out here, which again, unfortunately, after such great performance in sprint qualifying the day before, is Nico Hülkenberg, who gets knocked down into 11th. Then big Q3 moments, we see Max set this massively fast pole position lap and then ultimately doesn't get out for his second time, but he manages to still hold that pole position despite the fact that he literally doesn't get a final lap in. Then we see Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc kind of put up better performance than we've been seeing from them. Charles Leclerc ends up in 3rd and Lewis Hamilton ends up in 5th. George Russell splits the Ferraris in 4th, Lando Norris takes 2nd, and very disappointingly, Oscar ends up in 6th. And this was the moment where it started to feel like Oscar was driving hesitantly and afraid to make a mistake after everything that happened in the sprint race. And I think that that actually continued into the Grand Prix itself. Frankly, when we talk about kind of championship mentality, I think the fact that Max is now in the game in a way that he has not felt like he was for most of the season, I think Max is actually affecting both Lando and Oscar more mentally than they were ever affecting each other. This is a real situation where you now have a 4-time world champion breathing down your neck and performing at a level that only Max can really do at this point. Max wants a 5th title, and to do 5 back-to-back would be absolutely bonkers in the technical term of it. And so I think we're seeing kind of Lando and Oscar both get a little shaken by this, both be a little shaken by the threat of Max really coming into the game again. And ultimately, we see Oscar not only having that fear, but also the frustration and kind of hesitancy from crashing out in the sprint. And so starting from 6 was tough. It meant that Oscar really needed to see some lap 1 chaos in order to make up those positions in the race itself. And remembering that Max really only needed like a 3-point gap in this race. Instead, we see him in 1st position with Oscar so far down that he could really make up some big points, which ultimately, obviously, he does. Those are highlights from qualifying. Let's talk about that race. Now, the Grand Prix itself was not as exciting as the sprint. I think we got a lot of those turn 1 jitters out, and then you have almost this tension that we're going to see everything happen again. But ultimately, I think kind of sometimes it feels like the sprint, if it's super chaotic, the Grand Prix itself is pretty calm, and that's what we ended up getting here. Heading out on the tires, most people started out on the mediums, which I think was expected. We expected the kind of combination to be a one-stop strategy with a medium and then switching to a soft, as the hard tire itself was that separate compound that we saw from Pirelli, meaning that the hard tire did not really prove to be a great race tire tire in these conditions and in this heat. So we expected most people to do a medium to a soft and end the race on a soft tire, really being able to take advantage of those final laps, trying to run the medium as far as they possibly could, and that's essentially what most people did. However, up front, we see Charles Leclerc make a risk and take a gamble of starting out on that soft tire and ultimately switching to the medium for the rest of the race. This would give him the opportunity to have a faster race pace right at the start of the race and hopefully get ahead of Max and try to make up some time. And with that, he does end up getting ahead of Lando. Obviously, he doesn't get in front of Max, but this one big move is actually really important for the rest of the race. I do think that while it was great to watch Max really just run another masterclass, watching Charles Leclerc run as defensive as he was able to this race was really exciting. I also think that that's what this track is all about. There is so many opportunities for passing and also so many opportunities to keep someone behind you. And we really got to see how great of a driver Charles Leclerc can be, especially when he's up in front, and also being able to keep Lando behind him as strongly as he did for as long as he did when Lando ultimately does have a better car than him was really, really, really impressive, and I think shows like caliber of driver with the car. There's always going to be a conversation in Formula One. Is it the car? Is it the driver? And the answer is always it's a combination of the two. But sometimes you have these moments in this sport where you remember that a driver can be a lot better than their car. And sometimes a car can be a lot of the factor for a driver's performance overall. And so I think watching Charles Leclerc and Lando battle throughout this race really was one of my favorite parts of the race because it showed how strong of a driver Charles Leclerc really is. And frankly, with the heat and with the amount of time that Charles was able to keep Lando in dirty air, that was really crucial for Max ultimately not having to really fight Lando in this race at all. How much time Lando spent behind Charles Leclerc, degrading his tires, keeping his car much hotter than it would have been, and eventually being able to make that pass, but also having to be told to kind of pull the car back, cool it down, calm down, and then make a move again. We did ultimately see Lando's engineer have to be a part of that mental process of figuring out how to make this work. I think that really shows how well Charles Leclerc was able to do, and it ultimately helps Max with his strategy as well. Other big moments obviously include Carlos Sainz taking Kimi Antonelli out in a big way early on in the race. Carlos ends up retiring. Kimi continues the race, but is completely all the way in the back. This was tough because one, Carlos has been having such a great run and such a great weekend this weekend with that kind of sprint podium, but also that Kimi Antonelli then has to try to fight his way from the back instead of being able to make up positions himself. We did see Kimi actually make up quite a few positions and get some really good passes in, and I really do think that while Kimi is not making these big splashy moments of getting on the podium consistently or winning races or anything like that, I do think Kimi is showing so much potential, and these moments where he's able to keep his head on straight and continue a race, continue making passes, continue moving his way up the field. And while he doesn't make it back into the points for this race, he does make up a lot of time, a lot of positions, and really just got handed a bad moment of getting completely spun out by Carlos. Carlos at the beginning of this race was ultimately found at fault for this and was handed a 5-grid penalty for the next race. But other than those big moments, we didn't have a ton of action this race, and again, I think a lot of that was shaken out in the sprint itself. I was actually expecting to see George make a move on Oscar and pass him, because as we even saw George say, Oscar was really driving slow. Oscar didn't make a lot of moves in this race. There really wasn't the pace there, and we just saw him driving so cautiously throughout this Grand Prix that he was barely on screen. I kind of expected to see George put in a lot of that performance, especially given how well he had done in the sprint. But again, we know that the car itself, the conditions were different. The car was lighter, all of these different things, and we don't ultimately ever really see George catch up to Oscar. And I actually really would have liked to have seen that. I'd like to see Oscar and George battling more and seeing what that looks like between the two of them. But obviously we didn't get there. We also for a moment thought we would get to see Lewis catch up to Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc, but ultimately there's a gap that ends up being made and he never makes it up. However, I do think the Ferrari performance, especially Lewis's performance this weekend, really shows improvement, which I think is a big positive, especially as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, we're seeing so much conversation about whether or not Fred should stay and continue running the team. And I think seeing Lewis's performance in particular move up, as well as Charles Leclerc ending up on the podium today, I think all of that's important in kind of continuing to keep the faith in Fred and continuing to see if he can bring this team back to the glory it used to have. I was happy to see Lewis seem a lot more comfortable in the car this weekend, and I would say if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, just don't lose hope. He is obviously out of mathematical contention for the Drivers' Championship this year, but I think we're watching this season of him consistently try to get a little bit more comfortable in the car, try to get a little bit more comfortable with the team, and I think this was a weekend where we saw that a little bit. So improvements for Ferrari are positive, and then of course we end up with Max winning this race. And it is starting to feel honestly like Max can do the impossible, because as we came into this weekend, Max had a gap of over 60 points between him and the championship leader. That has now been cut down to 40. That means going into the rest of this season, of which we have 5 race weekends left, with 5 Grand Prix and 2 additional sprints, Max needs to outscore Oscar by 8 points every weekend. And if Oscar continues to have the performance he had this weekend, it's really not going to be a tough one. Additionally, Lando is now breathing down Oscar's neck as well with these point gaps. The way the championship sits now, Oscar comes away from this weekend at 346 points. Lando is just behind him at 332 points. And Max is now at 306 points. And frankly, I actually think a lot of what's happening is that because Lando and Oscar have been so focused on each other, nobody was focused on the fact that Max might be able to come up here. And because these two McLaren drivers are splitting points, splitting race weekends and things like that, it's giving Max this opportunity to be the sole focus of this championship. Honestly, if we were talking about anyone else, I don't know that I would be telling you a 40-point gap is something that can be made up in the rest of this season. But frankly, not only if Max keeps his head on straight, but if Oscar and Lando can't keep their heads on straight, there's a real threat to this championship, and that threat's name is Max Verstappen. I think that that is the biggest come away from this weekend, and I frankly really think that he could do it. So that wraps up the race recap. Let's get into your questions, predictions, and hot takes. Okay, starting out with questions, someone wanted to know why there were no penalties for the sprint collisions. I did go over this briefly, but just to kind of hammer it home, ultimately this was ruled a racing incident. What happens when we have a collision like this is that we look at it and try to determine if one driver was at fault when it comes to the rules of racing. And if a driver didn't actually make an illegal move or cause a collision completely at fault of their own, ultimately we just rule it a racing incident, and that's what happened here. Despite Zach Brown saying that it was Nico's fault and then retracting that, despite some people feeling like it was Oscar's fault, the same way that last race weekend in Singapore, Lando's collision with Oscar was ruled a racing incident and not given a penalty, this is the same thing. It just feels a lot more dramatic because 4 cars crashed out. Also, I do feel like it's relevant to say that, of course, because we're currently having this big drama between Oscar, Lando, McLaren, who's being favored, who isn't, any sort of incident that involves the two of them is going to be so hyper-analyzed that someone is looking for fault. And sometimes the answer really is that nobody was legally at fault. Is Max still in contention for the Drivers' Championship? Yes, and I think we have to say that yes, because it's Max, but essentially Max just needs to outscore Oscar Piastri by 8 points for the rest of the race weekends. This does mean that he does need at least one weekend where the gap is not first and second. So even if Max wins every race and sprint race, Oscar can't finish second in every single race and sprint race because he would still win by a couple of points. However, if Max can get another weekend like this one, it becomes even easier, of course. And if Lando continues to want to try to cut into Oscar's lead, that also gives Max this extra wiggle room because Oscar really has to fight off 2 people. Lando obviously also needs to fight off Oscar and Max, but I think you're going to see him focused more on Oscar, given the fact that he's currently sitting in second. And you would rather see Oscar kind of drop down and then Max kind of coming after him after that than to be fighting Max and Oscar at the same time. I think the actual real conversation is going to be how much of McLaren's focus gets split between their own 2 drivers, how much of their own drivers are focused on each other rather than Max as a threat himself, and how much Max is really locked in and the car's performance really continues to go that way. Even this weekend, we saw Max actually complaining about certain things with the car itself, and so the question really is, how do these cars hold up as well as the driver's mentality? But a long answer to your very short question, yes, Max is still in contention for this driver's title, and frankly, I think he can do it. Also, another big thing that is in this hot take section, which is technically not a hot take, we're just excited about it, Lewis Hamilton officially became the first driver to ever score 5,000 career points in Formula One. And so I think sometimes, even when he's having these tough seasons back to back, it's hard to remember how much of a big deal he is in this sport. And the fact that he's still going, still scoring real points, and crossing that 5,000 point finish line is a really big deal. Hot take number 1, with Max a threat, McLaren will refuse to back Oscar, but as soon as Norris is leading the championship, they will back him. This is an interesting take because I do think there is going to be a question of, does McLaren eventually kind of switch and say one of these drivers is more important than the other because Max is coming down to potentially take out both of their drivers? Right now, obviously with Oscar leading the championship, it would make sense to prioritize Oscar, but because the margin is so close, it is tough to say, okay, Oscar definitely gets to win the championship and we've decided. They've kind of maintained this idea that they are going to allow their drivers to race, and if that's the case, it means that they can't prioritize one driver over the other, and that lack of prioritization may end in both of them not winning the championship, which I think is really interesting. I do also think that it's fair to say that you think one of these drivers is going to end up being prioritized over the other, and we did see Oscar ask to take a step back last year when there was this slight chance that Lando might be able to compete with Max. So I think only time will tell, but it will be a really interesting thing to keep an eye on. I feel like Lando's winning it because people aren't saying he will and that's his MO. I do think that that's actually very funny. There's this kind of world where he's started with this Lando no wins thing, kind of taking in negative energy and trying to turn it into a motivating factor. And so it could be funny to watch him just suddenly like lock right in. Oscar decline is going to keep happening and Max will win the title in Abu Dhabi. I agree with it. I agree with this one. If Max wins WDC, he might need to get Charles a very nice Christmas present after this race. Legitimate. I do think sometimes we forget how much drivers come into the factor of the championship overall. Even if you personally aren't fighting for it, every point you take away from one of the drivers who is fighting for it is a big deal. And Charles was a big portion of Max not having to fight Lando this race. And so maybe we'll see him get a fruit basket. Another take I did see that I thought was really interesting was this idea that Max could get into the championship, and if he wins by the number of points that he did not score in Barcelona, what does that mean for the fact that he took George out, which we completely have kind of forgotten about? That was so far back in the cycle that it was when Max was just totally certain he wasn't winning the championship, and so he did this kind of, ridiculous move, which ultimately ended in him not scoring any points that weekend, and he would have taken away points. So I am curious if he does get to the end of the season and the championship he loses by those number of points. Ooh, that's a tough one to swallow. And lastly, a number of people manifested a Lewis podium in Mexico City, and honestly, I would love to see it. I think we're getting so close to him kind of getting that moment. I thought for a while we would end up with it in Texas this weekend, and I think if he can stand on that podium in Ferrari red, mentally it will be a really big factor. Obviously, it will also be a really big factor in the conversation that we're having about Lewis in all of the media every weekend. People will have to stop saying that he hasn't had a podium in red, and I think all of that will be a really big factor to him having better performance overall. So personally, I hope that your kind of digital candle manifestation does work. That wraps up our hot takes and predictions and this week's race recap. If you're listening to this and you have not subscribed to the show, please make sure that you're subscribed either on YouTube or whatever podcast app you're listening to this on right now. And of course, make sure that you're following me on social media so that you can get your hot takes, questions, and predictions in every single week. You can find me on all platforms: TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Tumblr, and Threads at Marissa Kumari. Also, be sure if you want to be involved in the live chat that we run during the race weekends themselves, join the Discord server in the link down below. This has been our total COTA recap, and I'll be back with the Mexico City recap next week.